The air inside the United Nations General Assembly felt heavy that morning, not from the chandeliers or marble walls, but from the words being spoken. Benjamin Netanyahu stood at the podium, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Cameras clicked, translators murmured, and the giant screen behind him showed maps of Gaza colored in red. Israel will crush Hamas, he declared, his tone unwavering. We will crush Gaza if we must. We will not apologize for defending ourselves. And we will do it with or without your approval. A smattering of applause followed, mostly from the same Western diplomats who had clapped 1,000 times before, each time pretending it was for peace. But in the corner row, under the golden seal of Burkina Faso, a young man did not move. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in his modest brown uniform, sat with his hands folded and his jaw clenched. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, as though humanity itself had failed another test. Netanyahu continued, his voice growing louder, as if the volume could erase the blood behind his words. Those who criticize us, he said, looking around the hall, do not understand what it means to be surrounded by enemies. Leadership requires strength, not pity. That last word, pity, lingered like poison in the air. It was the word used by colonizers when they spoke of Africa. It was the word used by empires when they bombed villages, for stability. Traoré's aide leaned closer and whispered, Mr. President, should we leave? Traoré shook his head slowly. No, he said softly. Let him finish. The world needs to hear what arrogance sounds like before it hears what truth feels like. The camera panned across the assembly, catching Traoré's calm face for only a second. But that single image, his stillness amid hypocrisy, began spreading across live broadcasts and social media feeds. The caption under his name read, Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, listening. When Netanyahu finished, the applause was thunderous. The same diplomats who had once justified wars in Iraq and Libya rose to their feet. But Traoré did not stand. He remained seated, his palms flat on the table, his eyes locked on the Israeli leader. For a brief moment, the cameras caught it, 2 men, 2 worlds, 2 definitions of power. One built on fear, the other on principle. And in that silence, before Traoré spoke a single word, something had already shifted. Across Africa, millions watching the broadcast began to type the same phrase. Let him speak. They didn't yet know that when he finally did, his words would echo beyond the walls of the United Nations, into the streets of Gaza, the fields of Ouagadougou, and the conscience of every leader who had forgotten what justice truly meant. Because this wasn't just another diplomatic speech waiting to be forgotten. It was the beginning of a confrontation the world was not ready for. When Netanyahu stepped down from the podium, the air was thick with applause, a hollow, mechanical noise that echoed through the UN chamber. But as the clapping faded, another sound emerged, silence. A slow, deliberate silence that made diplomats glance toward the back rows, where Ibrahim Traoré was rising to his feet. The Burkinabe leader walked to the stage without hurry, his boots tapping softly against the marble floor. There was no entourage, no teleprompter, no scripted gesture. Only a young African soldier standing before a world that had forgotten courage. When he reached the microphone, he didn't look at Netanyahu. He looked at the flags behind him, symbols of nations that claimed peace while funding war. Mr. President Netanyahu, Traoré began, his voice deep and steady, you speak of defense, but what you defend are your crimes. You speak of enemies, yet the only enemy in Gaza is hunger, rubble, and the cries of children buried under the weight of your bombs. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Netanyahu's expression hardened, but Traoré didn't stop. His tone grew colder, sharper. You say you will crush Gaza, then you will face Africa. Because Africa knows what oppression looks like, we've lived it, survived it, and buried empires that thought they were eternal. Every sentence hit like a drumbeat. Delegates who had been half asleep were suddenly awake. The translation headsets buzzed with delay as interpreters struggled to keep pace. Do not mistake silence for submission, Traoré continued. When we do not shout, it's not because we fear you. It's because we are watching, and when Africa rises, it does not ask for permission. Netanyahu shifted in his seat, whispering something to an aide. The camera zoomed in on Traoré's face, calm, unflinching, lit by conviction. Israel claims to be a democracy, he said, but democracy does not mean destroying the powerless. It means protecting them. You cannot bomb your way to peace. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the translators hesitated, unsure if what they'd heard could truly be said inside the UN. Then, slowly, people began to clap, first from the African section, then from Latin America, then scattered across Asia. It wasn't the thunder of power, but the quiet applause of awakening. Netanyahu's fists tightened on the table. Traoré simply stepped back from the microphone, nodded once to the assembly, and walked away, leaving behind an echo that would haunt the hall long after he was gone. The moment Traoré's footsteps faded from the stage, Netanyahu leaned back in his chair, his jaw stiff. The applause still echoed faintly through the chamber, not for him, but for a soldier from a country he once considered irrelevant. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and before long, the Prime Minister of Israel disappeared behind the curtain, escorted by his aides. Inside a private UN conference room, the walls were soundproof, the windows sealed. A small group awaited him, American diplomats, a British envoy, and a French advisor. Netanyahu slammed his notes on the table. "This African boy just humiliated me in front of the world," he snapped. "And you all sat there." The U.S. ambassador shifted uncomfortably. "Prime Minister, his speech was propaganda." Netanyahu cut him off. "He talks about Gaza as if he's lived there. What does Burkina Faso know about war?" "Apparently enough to call you out," murmured the British envoy under his breath. Netanyahu turned sharply. "What did you say?" "Nothing," the man replied, his tone suddenly neutral. "Only that his words are trending everywhere. #Traoré speaks truth, it's all over social media." Netanyahu rubbed his temples, pacing the room. "The world has the memory of a child," he muttered. "Tomorrow, they'll move on to another scandal." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Traoré's words had pierced deeper than headlines, they had struck at Israel's moral armor, the illusion of untouchable righteousness. "Contact the U.S. State Department," Netanyahu ordered coldly. "I want pressure on Burkina Faso. Sanctions, trade reviews, whatever it takes." He wants to play the hero? Let's see how long his people can eat pride instead of bread. The American diplomat hesitated. "Sir, punishing him might make him stronger. Africans see him as a voice of resistance." Netanyahu's eyes narrowed, then silenced the voice. For a moment, no one breathed. The air in the room turned icy. Outside, the UN press hall was alive with energy, journalists rushing to replay Traoré's words, to dissect every phrase. One reporter whispered to another, "Did you see the way he said, 'Then you'll face Africa'? It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy." Meanwhile, in a quiet hotel room across town, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone watching the replay of his own speech. The world had just changed, and he knew it. He wasn't looking for applause. He was preparing for the storm that always follows truth. 2 weeks after the UN confrontation, the ripples had turned into waves. International news networks still replayed Traoré's words, but behind the headlines, the Western machinery had begun to move. In Washington, Tel Aviv, and Paris, the conversation was the same: contain him. The U.S. Treasury quietly reviewed Burkina Faso's aid agreements. France suspended a mining equipment shipment. Israeli lobbyists in Europe pushed narratives painting Traoré as a radical populist, destabilizing West Africa. Within days, prices in Ouagadougou rose. Fuel lines grew longer. Markets whispered rumors of shortages. But inside the presidential palace, Traoré remained calm. He had expected this. Empires didn't forgive humiliation. In a small briefing room, his closest advisors gathered: ministers, generals, and economists. Maps of Africa covered the walls, red pins marking Western bases, gold routes, and energy corridors. "They've started the squeeze," said Finance Minister Diallo. "U.S. banks are delaying transactions. France is threatening to block our exports through Côte d'Ivoire." Traoré listened silently, fingers tapping on the table. Good, he said finally. Now we know who fears us. His generals exchanged confused looks. Sir, one of them asked cautiously, what's good about this? It means, Traore replied, that they still think they can starve Africa into obedience. That illusion is our weapon. He stood and walked toward the map. They believe we are alone, he said. But we are not. We will not respond with speeches, we will respond with alliances. That night, a series of encrypted calls were made from the palace. Within hours, replies came from across the continent, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad. The same nations that had broken free from French control answered Traore's signal. It's time, Traore told them, for Africa to act as one. Over the following days, he initiated what would later be called the Sahel Compact. A coalition of nations agreeing to share gold reserves, trade directly with Russia and China, and create a joint defense mechanism against Western interference. When a French ambassador tried to reach him for negotiations, Traore's secretary delivered a message in his name. Tell Paris this, Africa's resources are no longer for sale. Not in gold. Not in silence. By the end of the week, the sanctions that were meant to break him had only made him stronger. Across Africa, murals appeared overnight, Traore's face beside the words, "We rise hungry, but free." And far away, in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu stared at a classified intelligence brief stamped with 3 words that made his jaw tighten. Traore forming bloc. He knew then that what had started as a speech was turning into a revolution. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu stood before a projection screen filled with satellite images, trade routes, and names of African leaders suddenly aligning with Burkina Faso. The Israeli intelligence chief spoke cautiously. The Sahel Compact is gaining traction, sir. Gold reserves are being pooled. Russian cargo planes have been spotted in Ouagadougou. Traore is building something bigger than an alliance. Netanyahu's eyes narrowed. Then we'll tear it apart before it grows. He turned toward his aide. Contact Cairo. Tell them to use their influence in the African Union. We can't attack Burkina Faso directly, but we can turn the neighbors against him. That same day, in Washington, the U.S. Secretary of State received a confidential message marked Priority, Middle East/Africa Strategy. The instruction was clear: use diplomatic channels to disrupt Traore's rise. Economic pressure, media framing, and offers of partnership, the usual tools of modern warfare. But while the West was plotting, Traore was already moving. In Ouagadougou, the presidential palace buzzed like a command center. Reports, encrypted messages, and coded updates came in from every corner of Africa. The Sahel Compact wasn't just surviving, it was expanding. Traore leaned over a polished map showing the continent's gold reserves. For centuries, he said to his council, they took our gold and gave us paper. Now, we will take our gold and buy our freedom. He called it the gold diplomacy. Instead of fighting sanctions with protests, he weaponized gold. Burkina Faso began to sell its reserves directly to partners in Asia, bypassing Western banks. The proceeds funded food programs, energy projects, and joint African defense initiatives. When an American reporter asked him if this wasn't provoking the West, Traore smiled slightly. They were already provoked, he said. We just stopped apologizing for existing. Meanwhile, in Paris, the economic shock was immediate. The French stock market trembled as gold contracts tied to West Africa began to collapse. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's ministers warned him that Africa was turning into a financial fortress. He's using gold like a sword, said one advisor. Every shipment he sells outside the West is another crack in the global system. Netanyahu gritted his teeth. Then we'll remind him what happens when you play with power. But Traore was already 10 moves ahead. He wasn't building an army of soldiers, he was building an army of nations. By the end of that month, African leaders from 7 countries had signed onto the Gold Diplomacy Pact. The message was simple: if you sanction one of us, you sanction all of us. And as the world markets trembled, Netanyahu finally realized, he was no longer facing just one man. He was facing an entire continent that had stopped bowing. Netanyahu's frustration had turned to strategy. He couldn't win with weapons or sanctions, so he turned to something more powerful: narratives. Within days, international media outlets began running synchronized headlines: Burkina Faso's dictator threatens stability. Traore's gold alliance risks African chaos. Western analysts called him reckless, radical, and dangerous. It was the oldest tactic of empire: when you can't kill a leader, you kill his image. In Ouagadougou, Traore watched the broadcasts in silence. The faces on screen spoke of democracy while defending exploitation. He turned off the television and faced his advisors. "They control the story," he said. "So we will create our own." That night, he launched a bold initiative: the Voice of the Free Continent. A Pan-African media network broadcasting in 5 languages, telling stories of independence, dignity, and resistance. It wasn't just news, it was a revolution on camera. From Dakar to Addis Ababa, local journalists joined the movement. Farmers, teachers, and students began sending videos of their lives, proof that Africa was rising without permission. Within a week, the hashtag Voice of Africa was trending across the continent. In a televised address, Traore declared, "For too long, others have told our story. Today, Africa speaks for itself." The broadcast reached millions. Netanyahu watched from his office, lips pressed thin. His information war was collapsing. The more they attacked Traore, the more authentic he became. A CNN analyst put it simply: they tried to silence him. Instead, they made him immortal. And somewhere in the Sahel night, as generators hummed and satellite dishes glowed, a voice from Burkina Faso carried across Africa. "We are not the shadows of history. We are its dawn." The West had grown desperate. When words failed and sanctions backfired, they turned to their oldest weapon: division. Across the continent, chaos began to spread like wildfire. In Niger, a coup attempt shook the capital. In Mali, mysterious explosions destroyed key infrastructure. Western media called them internal conflicts, but Traore knew better. The fingerprints of foreign intelligence were everywhere. Late one night, inside the war room of the presidential palace, Traore stood before a dimly lit map of Africa, glowing red with signs of unrest. His generals argued for retaliation, for purging all foreign influence by force. But Traore raised a hand. "That's exactly what they want," he said calmly. "An Africa too busy fighting itself to stand as one." He looked to his advisors, eyes burning with quiet resolve. "Then we will give them the one thing they fear most: unity." 2 days later, invitations went out to every African nation, north to south, east to west. The message was short, written in his own hand. "Let us meet not as states, but as a people." And so began preparations for the Unity Summit. Set to take place in Ouagadougou, it would be the first African-led gathering with no Western observers, no IMF representatives, and no foreign press. Just leaders, soldiers, and thinkers determined to shape their own destiny. Western capitals panicked. France called it a dangerous precedent. Washington called it a geopolitical risk. Tel Aviv called it a threat. Netanyahu reportedly told his cabinet, "If that summit succeeds, the West loses Africa forever." Meanwhile, across the continent, something unprecedented was happening: African citizens crowdfunding the event, volunteering to build the summit grounds, painting murals of hope on city walls. One slogan appeared again and again: "We were divided by borders. We will unite by purpose." And as the day of the summit approached, even the earth beneath Burkina Faso seemed to hold its breath. The day of the Unity Summit arrived like a sunrise after centuries of night. From every corner of Africa, convoys rolled toward Ouagadougou. Flags of nations once divided now waved side by side: Mali beside Ghana, Congo beside Libya, Egypt beside Burkina Faso. It wasn't just a conference, it was a resurrection. Traore stood backstage, watching the sea of leaders, soldiers, and citizens gathered under the vast dome of the new Pan-African Hall. His security chief whispered, "Sir, our intelligence intercepted chatter, someone wants to disrupt the summit." Traore didn't flinch. "Let them come," he said softly. "They will witness what cannot be destroyed." When he stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. Cameras from the Voice of the Free Continent went live, broadcasting to every African home. "Brothers and sisters," Traore began, "for too long, our future was written in languages not our own. They drew our borders, mined our gold, and called it civilization. But today, we write our own story." Applause thundered. Outside, the streets were packed with people holding candles, chanting his name. "They say Africa is poor," he continued, voice rising. "But they forget we are the source of their wealth. They say we are divided, but they fear the day we stand together, because that day is today." At that very moment, in a van parked miles away, a satellite signal spiked. An Israeli drone operator received orders from an encrypted line: "Cut the broadcast. If possible, hit the power grid." As Traore lifted his hand to close his speech, the lights in the hall flickered. Gasps filled the air. For a brief second, everything went dark. But then, from somewhere in the crowd, thousands of cell phone flashlights lit up, one after another, like stars refusing to die. Traore smiled. "Even if they take our light," he said through the echo of static, "Africa will still shine." The cameras came back online seconds later, too late for the saboteurs, just in time for the world to witness a continent illuminated by its people. And in that instant, Netanyahu realized his greatest fear had come true: the more they tried to silence Traore, the louder Africa became. Netanyahu's office in Jerusalem was silent, except for the flickering glow of television screens replaying the summit's finale. The drone strike had failed. The broadcast had gone viral. Across the world, millions had seen Africa stand in unity beneath the flickering lights of Ouagadougou. "We've lost control of the narrative," muttered an aide. Netanyahu slammed his fist on the table. "Then we create a new one. Call Washington. Call Paris. We need containment, now." Within hours, a secret trilateral meeting began between Israeli, French, and American officials. Maps of Africa filled the digital walls. Burkina Faso was marked in red. The plan was brutal but clear: economic strangulation, coordinated disinformation, and covert destabilization. "He's turning Africa against us," said the French delegate. "No," Netanyahu corrected coldly. "He's turning Africa into itself. And that's more dangerous." But far away in Ouagadougou, Traore had already anticipated their next move. The Unity Summit was over, but its purpose was just beginning. In a dimly lit room inside the palace, surrounded by his closest allies, he signed a document that would send tremors through the global order: the Declaration of Sovereignty. The declaration wasn't just for Burkina Faso, it was for every African nation tired of begging for permission to breathe. It announced the formation of the African Sovereign Union, rejecting IMF control, Western military bases, and foreign ownership of natural resources. "Our gold, our oil, our land, belong to our people," Traore said. "And no flag outside this continent will command us again." When the declaration was read aloud on international television, Western markets plummeted overnight. The euro dipped, the dollar shook, and gold prices soared as African nations began withdrawing their reserves. In the UN chamber, silence reigned. The same seats that once ignored Africa now trembled before it. A journalist whispered, "This isn't rebellion anymore, it's rebirth." And as the world screens filled with the image of Ibrahim Traoré signing that declaration, Netanyahu watched from his office, pale, exhausted, and finally, afraid. He muttered under his breath, "If Africa truly stands, the West will kneel." Weeks after the declaration of sovereignty, the world's balance began to shift. Western economies stumbled, their media blamed African instability, but everyone knew the truth: Africa had stopped bleeding. Across the continent, a new current flowed. In markets once flooded with imported goods, African-made tools and food appeared. Gold reserves once locked in foreign banks were being used to build schools, hospitals, and solar grids. Burkina Faso, once called poor, had become the heart of a continental awakening. On a warm evening, under the orange sky of Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before thousands gathered in Revolution Square. Flags from every African nation waved together. Drums echoed across the night, carrying the rhythm of a continent reborn. "My brothers and sisters," he began, "they tried to buy our silence with aid and our loyalty with fear. But we remembered who we are, the children of warriors, builders, dreamers. We do not sell our future." The crowd erupted. Women lifted torches, soldiers saluted, and elders wept openly. "They wanted our gold," Traoré continued, his voice steady. "But gold is no longer their weapon, it is our shield. We turned what they stole into what will set us free." His words echoed through the streets, into radios, through satellite feeds. Even in Jerusalem, Netanyahu watched the speech, his political alliances fracturing, his health declining, his empire of influence fading. He whispered bitterly, "The African soldier did what armies could not, he changed the world." Back in the square, Traoré looked toward the horizon. The air was thick with song, not of victory, but of renewal. Behind him, a giant banner read, "Africa is no longer rising, Africa has risen." He raised his fist slowly, not in defiance, but in promise. "Let history write this clearly," he said. "Africa was never a shadow of the world. We are its light." And as the drums thundered and the crowd roared, the golden glow of the setting sun spilled over the city, reflecting off the coins, the soil, and the hearts of a people who had finally reclaimed both their treasure and their destiny.